My name is Arthur Lawrence Alarcon. I was born in Los Angeles, California on August 14, 1925. My father was born in a tiny community called Carrizal in Chihuahua, in Mexico. He was born in 1900. My mother was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Her name was Margaret Seiss. My family fled from Mexico in 1910 at the start of the revolution in Mexico. The reason they had to flee from Mexico is that my grandfather was, in addition to running his ranch, was also a federal officer. And he was a combination tax collector, customs official, immigration officer. And he also used his ranch hands as his deputies. And when Pancho Villa came north during the revolution, my grandfather got a message from Mexico City that they were going to kill my grandfather and his family. So my grandfather, his wife, and his 5 children fled on the midnight train to El Paso with only the clothes on their back. So that's how my family was introduced into the United States. My father met my mother here in Los Angeles about 1923, and her name was Margaret Seiss. Her family was from Albuquerque and Santa Fe, but she was born in Albuquerque. I had 3 uncles who served in World War II. Two of them in the Army, and one of them in the Navy. My oldest uncle was named Juan. Next was my poor uncle named Dolores, who had to fight his way home every night from school in El Paso because of his name. And my youngest uncle was named Andres. I know that my uncle John and my uncle Dolores served overseas. My youngest uncle was in the Navy, and I'm not sure of his service. So I didn't speak English until I was 5 years old, when my father remarried and brought me to Los Angeles with my stepmother. We lived on a street called Court Street in Los Angeles when we first got here, which is about a mile from the La Placita and a mile from Temple Street and Spring Street. It's interesting because my first home here in Los Angeles was on Court Street. When I became a prosecutor, my first job was in the Hall of Justice on Temple Street, and I was born on Temple Street, about a mile and a half from my first job in the Hall of Justice. When I became a Superior Court judge, I was put, my first court was in the Hall of Justice on Temple Street. We later moved across the street into what is now the Clara Shortridge Foltz building. I was appointed to the California Court of Appeal, and briefly I lived, or my office was on Wilshire Boulevard. But when I was appointed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, my present job, it's back on Temple Street, on Temple and Spring. So I've only gone about a mile and a half in my whole life. I was even baptized at La Placita, so I have not gone very far in life. While I was in my senior year in 1943, the Pentagon created a new program called the Specialized Training Program. And they advertised in all the high schools, if you are a senior in high school and you pass this test, we will send you to college in an accelerated program for 2 years. And when you graduate from that program, and that's after you've enlisted, you will become a second lieutenant. So I took that test, and I passed the test. So when we finished our training, they announced to all of us, what schools we were going to be sent to. And they picked for me Pomona College. And I thought that's wonderful because all of my friends were in the military and off in Japan fighting the Japanese or in Europe. And I was going to be in Pomona College, 25 miles away from all the girls in my little black book. So I was very happy. We marched down to the train station. Fort Benning is that big. They have their own railroad station. And when we got there, the general stood up and said, "There's been a delay. We're going to have to just sit down and wait till we get a message from Washington." So 5 hours later, we stood up at attention, and the general said, "The program has been canceled. You are all transferred into the infantry." So I arrived in Camp McCain, Mississippi, and spent 6 months training to be an infantry soldier. After 6 months, because of large casualties in North Africa, and by the way, that was the reason that my program, the specialized training program, was canceled. That's why I didn't go to college under the military. We were scheduled to go overseas as an infantry unit. All of us were frightened that we might be sent to fight in the Pacific War because we had been told that the Japanese were not very kind to prisoners. And in fact, there was high casualty of killing of American soldiers in the Pacific War. So on the Sunday before they announced where we were going, either Europe or the Pacific sector, every church in Camp McCain was covered by soldiers. Parking lot had soldiers out front kneeling, and our prayers were answered. We were sent to Europe. D-Day was announced while we were in England, but we were not in the first wave. I landed in Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day, but they had no facilities, so we got off of the landing craft with 90 pounds on our back and our rifles, and we had to wade through water this deep to go to the shore. This photograph was taken after we were sent to the front lines in France and around the Brittany Peninsula, but still in France. And we went through a park in a city called Nantes, or Nantes, and we are in our infantry outfit, and an itinerant photographer came across the park, and two of the people in this photograph, the one on the right, to my right, and the one to my left, were Jewish. The photographer yelled out in Yiddish, "Landsman, Landsman," which means countryman. And so they yelled back to him, Landsman. So they hugged each other, and he took our photograph. And after he left, somebody ran up and said, "There's a sniper, a German sniper, in the trees behind you." So we crawled over and we got him out of the trees right behind where that photograph was taken, because the war was still on. Fortunately, he didn't shoot at us. During the fighting in a city called Trier in France, right near the Rhine, my legs were frozen. And so I had to go to the hospital. And so Arthur Raffel took my place as the lead scout. And unfortunately for him, he was killed. Yeah, by German bullets. I might well have been the one because he took my job to go first with the unit. Being in the infantry, we were in the front lines, and there was one occasion when we were in a village, and the Germans had not only infantry troops, but tanks. And they came and surrounded this village, and they outnumbered us. And one of the tanks came down a roadway towards where we were, and with his machine gun, hit the sergeant who was next to me. I was so angry at what they were doing that I was trying to fire my rifle through the 88 cannon that the tank had to see if somehow that would get them. Fortunately, we were able to retreat out of that, and about 18 of us went to a barn. And the barn was of concrete, and I looked out through a window, and there were about 8 American soldiers in a pathway about half a block away, and they were all wounded. So I turned around to 3 officers who were in this, where we'd escaped, and I said to them, aren't we supposed to go out and help the people? You know the phrase, no one left behind. And they turned their back on me. So there was a man, one of my colleagues named Steinberg, who was a very skinny guy with a protruding Adam's apple and bottle cap glasses, who stepped forward and said, I'll help you. So I said, okay, but we're not Red Cross, so we're not free from being shot at under the Geneva Convention. So take off your helmet, leave your rifle, leave your ammunition, leave your hand grenades and all of these things we carried, and we're going to go out there without that. So we went out and we crawled up to where these men were, and as I started talking to them, I said, there are only 2 of us and there are 8 of you. So those of you who can crawl, I know you're wounded, you'll have to crawl, and we'll have to drag the ones that can't. And then I heard a tank coming up. And I turned around, and a German tank was about 25 feet from me. And the tank commander lowered the 88 cannon down towards my body, and then lifted the lid on the tank, and a German officer stood up and looked down, took his cap off, scratched his head, and turned the tank around and left. This is a photograph of me after I'd finished my training in Mississippi with the 94th Division. We were given a week's furlough before we were to go to Europe. So I took the train from Camp McCain, Mississippi to El Paso because I wanted to see my grandmother, because I figured at her age she would not possibly be around, and I might not return. I did not experience any adverse treatment, any discrimination because of my ethnicity from my fellow soldiers or from my officers. In fact, after one battle, the captain came up to me and said, Private Alarcon? I said, yes, sir. He said, you are now Staff Sergeant Alarcon. I have the power to give you a battlefield commission. So I went from being a private, first class, to being a staff sergeant from a European background captain. Later on, when the war ended and when we were in Czechoslovakia, he appointed me acting first sergeant. I was only 19. I was the youngest man in my infantry company, and yet I had 200 men under my command my last weeks in the military.